that the Indian government doesn't want you to read. A memoir written by one of India's most senior military commanders that's been sitting in bureaucratic purgatory for over a year. And what makes this book so dangerous that it's triggered parliamentary shutdowns, political firestorms, and accusations of government censorship? The answer lies in what it reveals about a night in August 2020 when nuclear-armed India and China came within meters of war. Before we dive into this explosive story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel because we're about to uncover details that have shaken India's parliament to its core. The book is called 4 Stars of Destiny, written by General Manoj Mukund Naravane, who served as India's Chief of Army Staff from December 2019 to April 2022. This wasn't just any military officer. Naravane led the Indian Army through one of its most challenging periods since 1962, during the violent border confrontation with China that culminated in the deadly Galwan Valley clash in June 2020. That clash left 20 Indian soldiers dead and an unknown number of Chinese casualties in brutal hand-to-hand combat fought in freezing darkness at 14,000 feet above sea level. So why hasn't this book been published? Officially, it's under review by the Ministry of Defense. Unofficially, the contents are so sensitive, so revealing about what actually happened during India's crisis with China, that the government has effectively blocked its release. And here's where it gets interesting. Even though the book remains unpublished, excerpts have leaked. Magazine articles have quoted from a manuscript. And when opposition leader Rahul Gandhi tried to reference these excerpts in Parliament just days ago, all hell broke loose. The defense minister shut him down. The home minister objected. The parliamentary affairs minister cited procedural violations. The speaker adjourned the House. 8 members of Parliament were suspended for the remainder of the budget session for protesting. And Rahul Gandhi, the leader of the opposition, wrote a formal complaint stating that for the first time in history, the opposition leader was prevented from speaking on matters of national security. What could possibly be in this book that's caused such panic? Let's start with the night of August 31st, 2020. This was 2.5 months after the Galwan Valley massacre. Tensions along the line of actual control were at their highest in decades. India and China had deployed tens of thousands of troops, backed by tanks, artillery, and fighter jets. Both sides were dug in for what would become a brutal Himalayan winter standoff. At 8:15 in the evening, Lieutenant General Yogesh Joshi, Chief of the Indian Army's Northern Command, received alarming intelligence. For Chinese tanks, supported by infantry, had begun moving up a steep mountain track toward Rechin-La in eastern Ladakh. These tanks were heading straight for Indian positions on the Kailash Range, strategic high ground that Indian forces had seized just hours earlier in a dangerous race with China's People's Liberation Army. General Joshi immediately contacted the Chief of Army Staff, General Naravane. And here's what Naravane writes in his memoir. He understood instantly that this was a crisis. Chinese tanks within a few hundred meters of Indian positions. 2 nuclear powers, eyeball to eyeball, in terrain where elevation means dominance and every meter matters. Indian soldiers on the ground fired an illuminating round, essentially a warning shot designed to say, "We see you, we're ready, don't come any closer." The Chinese tanks kept advancing. So what did General Naravane do? Exactly what military protocol demands. He began making frantic phone calls to India's political and military leadership. Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, Chief of Defense Staff General Bipin Rawat, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. And according to his memoir, to each and every one of them, his question was the same. What are my orders? Remember, this is the Chief of Army Staff asking for clear direction during a potential shooting war with China. There was an existing protocol. Naravane had clear orders not to open fire until cleared from the very top, from the Prime Minister, because opening fire could mean the first combat between Indian and Chinese forces in 45 years. It could mean escalation that spirals into full-scale war between two countries with nuclear weapons. Minutes ticked by. The Chinese tanks kept advancing. At 9:10 in the evening, General Joshi called again. The tanks were now less than 1 kilometer from Indian positions. The situation was deteriorating. General Naravane called Defense Minister Rajnath Singh again at 9:25, specifically asking for clear directions. And here's what his memoir reveals. None came. Not immediately, anyway. According to the excerpts that have been leaked, Singh eventually told Naravane that he had spoken with Prime Minister Modi, and the instruction was this: Jo uchit samjo wo karo. In Hindi, that translates to do whatever you deem appropriate. Let that sink in for a moment. The Chief of Army Staff, facing Chinese tanks advancing on Indian positions with the potential for the first armed conflict between nuclear powers in the region, was essentially told, "You decide." The onus was now totally on him. The response would be purely a military decision. Now, defenders of the government argue this isn't indecision. They say it's strategic delegation, giving the commander on the ground the authority to respond to a fast-moving situation without waiting for approvals from Delhi. But critics, particularly in the opposition Congress Party, see it very differently. They argue that when tanks from two nuclear-armed nations are within direct firing range, political leadership should provide unambiguous direction, not leave the army chief to make life-or-death decisions alone. So what did General Naravane decide? He positioned Indian tanks at the forward slopes of Rechin La Pass. He trained guns on the advancing Chinese positions. He initiated what he describes as a high-stakes game of bluff. And here's the crucial detail from his memoir. Their light tanks would have been no match for our medium tanks. It was a game of bluff, and the PLA blinked first. The Chinese tanks stopped. No shots were fired. The immediate crisis passed. Indian positions were preserved. According to Naravane's account, the restraint shown by both sides averted what could have been catastrophic escalation. But the question that haunts this entire episode is what would have happened if the Chinese hadn't stopped? What would have happened if General Naravane had been forced to make the decision to fire? And that's why this book is so controversial. Because it reveals a gap between the government's public narrative and what actually happened on the ground. Publicly, India's leadership projected strength and decisiveness during the China crisis. Prime Minister Modi visited Ladakh, delivered speeches about how the era of expansionism is over, reassured the nation that not 1 inch of territory had been lost. The official line was firm, clear, unambiguous. But Naravane's memoir suggests a different reality. A reality of frantic phone calls, of requests for clear orders that didn't come, of a military commander left to shoulder the burden of potentially starting a war. A reality where the political leadership, when faced with the ultimate test, said do what you think is appropriate and left the room. And it's not just about that one night. The memoir reportedly covers much more. It discusses the Galwan Valley clash itself, where 20 Indian soldiers died in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Some beaten with iron rods wrapped in barbed wire. Others pushed off cliffs into the freezing Galwan River. Still others succumbing to hypothermia in sub-zero temperatures. The memoir allegedly details that Indian soldiers briefly held in Chinese custody were beaten and mistreated, claims the Modi government has publicly acknowledged but never fully explored. The book also reveals tensions around the Agnipath military recruitment scheme, a controversial program introduced in 2022. Naravane writes that the scheme caught the Navy and Air Force completely off guard. that the Army's original proposal was for a small-scale pilot project retaining 75% of recruits, but the final government version flipped that, retaining only 25%. He objected to the initially proposed salary of 20,000 rupees per month, writing, "This was just not acceptable." Here we were talking about a trained soldier who was expected to lay down his life for the country. Surely a soldier could not be compared with a daily wage laborer. The salary was eventually raised to 30,000 rupees, but only after strong military pushback. These are the kinds of details that governments find uncomfortable. They complicate the official narrative. They show decision-making processes that look messy, reactive, and sometimes indecisive rather than strategic and commanding. So the manuscript was submitted for Ministry of Defense clearance in 2023. It was scheduled for publication in April 2024 by Penguin Random House. But clearance never came. The book has been sitting in review for over a year. The publisher was instructed not to share excerpts or soft copies. Online listings still show it as currently unavailable. General Naravane himself has said publicly that his job was to write and submit the manuscript. The responsibility for obtaining permission lies with the publisher and the ministry. He's characterized the delay by saying the book is maturing like aged wine in the review process. But leaked excerpts started appearing anyway. First in December 2023 through news agencies. Then in late January 2026, the Caravan magazine published a detailed essay titled Naravane's Moment of Truth, quoting extensively from the unpublished manuscript. That's when opposition leader Rahul Gandhi decided to raise the issue in Parliament during the motion of thanks debate on the president's address. Gandhi attempted to quote from the Caravan article, which cited Naravane's memoir about Chinese tanks entering Indian territory. Defense Minister Rajnath Singh immediately objected. How can you quote from an unpublished book? Is this authenticated? Gandhi insisted the source was authentic, that he had even submitted a signed copy affirming it was correct to the best of his knowledge, the standard parliamentary procedure for authentication. But the Speaker ruled against him. Parliamentary Affairs Minister Kiren Rijiju said the Speaker had already passed a ruling and Gandhi shouldn't raise the issue repeatedly. The next day, Gandhi tried again. Same objections. Same adjournment. By the third day, the situation escalated. 7 Congress MPs and 1 Communist Party MP were suspended for the remainder of the budget session, which ends April 2nd, for unruly behavior. They were accused of trying to climb on the Secretary General's table, tearing papers, and hurling them at the Speaker's chair. And Rahul Gandhi wrote directly to the Speaker, stating, "I am lodging my strong protest over being disallowed from speaking in the House on a matter of national security. This is a blot on our democracy. It is for the first time in history that the leader of the opposition was not allowed to speak on the motion of thanks on the president's address." Meanwhile, opposition politician Priyanka Gandhi Vadra held a press conference in Parliament, saying the government is scared of what will be revealed. She alleged the government blocked the book's publication because it shows what the reaction of our top leadership, our Prime Minister, Home Minister, and Defense Minister was in times of crisis when China was at our border. What did they say and do? It clearly shows their character when the country is being attacked. The government's counter-argument has been consistent. You cannot quote unpublished material in Parliament. The book hasn't received official clearance. If General Naravane believes his memoir reveals accurate information and has been unjustly barred from release, he should say so publicly. Defense Minister Rajnath Singh even suggested that if the book's contents were truly accurate, it would have been published by now. But that argument rings hollow to many observers. Because retired military officers in India are required to seek clearance before publishing material related to their service, especially on sensitive operational matters. The Central Civil Service's Pension Amendment rules from 2021 prohibit retired officials from intelligence and security organizations from publishing information without prior permission. And while defense services aren't explicitly covered under these rules, the Ministry of Defense reviews all such manuscripts as standard practice. So we're left with a catch-22. The government controls the clearance process. The government is blocking publication. And then the government argues that because the book isn't published, it can't be discussed. It's a perfect mechanism for burying inconvenient truths. What makes this even more significant is the broader context of India-China relations. The Galwan clash in June 2020 was the deadliest confrontation between the two countries in over 4 decades. 20 Indian soldiers died. China initially claimed no casualties, then 8 months later admitted to 4 deaths. U.S. intelligence suggested Chinese casualties were much higher, possibly 35. The truth remains murky. Following Galwan, both countries stationed tens of thousands of troops along the line of actual control. Multiple rounds of military and diplomatic talks followed. Partial disengagement occurred at some friction points, but other areas remained tense with buffer zones in place. It wasn't until October 2024 that India and China reached an agreement on border patrols, with Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar stating the disengagement process had been completed. That agreement paved the way for the first meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping since 2020, on the sidelines of the BRICS summit. But has the issue truly been resolved? Or has it just been managed, frozen, kicked down the road? Naravane's memoir suggests the latter. It portrays a situation where India reacted to Chinese moves rather than anticipating them, where intelligence and surveillance failed to detect the scale and intent of Chinese troop concentrations, where local commanders underestimated what was coming, where diplomatic meetings happened without official written records, leaving each side with different interpretations of what was agreed. And perhaps most damaging, where political leadership, when tested at the critical moment, didn't provide the clear, decisive orders that the situation demanded. These are not the hallmarks of strategic mastery. These are the hallmarks of crisis management, of muddling through, of hoping restraint and tactical skill can compensate for strategic ambiguity. Now, supporters of the government have pointed to other accounts. Lieutenant General Y.K. Joshi, who was Northern Command Chief during the crisis, published his own memoir called Who Dares Wins, a soldier's memoir. In it, he describes Operation Snow Leopard, the Indian military response after Galwan. He writes about due planning and preparation, about completely taking the PLA by surprise, bringing them back to the negotiation table, forcing them to beat a hasty retreat. His account emphasizes initiative, execution, success. But notice what's different. Joshi's book was published. He received clearance. His narrative aligns more closely with the government's preferred story. Success, not hesitation. Initiative, not reaction. Clear outcomes, not uncomfortable questions. The books that get published are the ones that don't rock the boat. The books that remain in bureaucratic limbo are the ones with inconvenient truths. And that's what makes General Naravane's 4 Stars of Destiny so important. Not because it's sensational, not because it's trying to embarrass anyone, but because it's honest. It shows military leadership doing their best in impossible circumstances. It shows the fog of war, the burden of command, the weight of decisions that could kill thousands. It shows that heroism isn't always about bold speeches and dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's about restraint, about choosing not to fire, about bearing the responsibility of that choice alone. But honesty is dangerous when it contradicts the official story. and so the book remains unpublished. And members of parliament get suspended for trying to discuss it, and opposition leaders get silenced. And the Indian public is left with questions that have no answers. What really happened during India's confrontation with China? How close did we come to war? Who made the critical decisions and how were they made? What lessons should be learned? What changes should be implemented? How do we ensure that next time, and there will be a next time, we're better prepared? These are the questions a democracy should be asking. These are the questions that books like 4 Stars of Destiny help us answer. And these are exactly the questions that someone, somewhere in New Delhi, very much wants to keep buried. Because if this book sees the light of day, it won't just be about one night in August 2020. It'll be about whether India's political leadership is willing to be held accountable for how they handle national security crises. Whether they're willing to be transparent about the gaps between public statements and private actions. Whether they're willing to let uncomfortable truths inform better policy rather than hiding those truths to protect political reputations. The Chinese aren't going away. The line of actual control isn't getting any less disputed. The Himalayan frontier will remain a flashpoint for decades to come. And when the next crisis hits, as it inevitably will, India's leaders will need to have learned from the last one. They'll need to provide clear orders. They'll need to have proper intelligence. They'll need to understand that delegation isn't the same as leadership, and that giving a general carte blanche in a potential nuclear flashpoint isn't strategic empowerment, it's abdication of responsibility. General Naravane's memoir could help provide those lessons.